In the harsh wilderness of the Wild West, where the law was merely lead, a lone cowboy, William Cassidy, stumbled upon a most heinous crime: a child's whisper coming from inside a jute sack. This frightening discovery led him to a gang of ruthless kidnappers, among whom was a man whose betrayal was even more terrible than his deeds. But fate had its own plan. The one who had left the boy for dead became his savior. Read on to see how this story unfolds, to learn why even in the darkest hearts, goodness can awaken, and justice finds its way, even if it has to be paid for in blood. A Cry in the Void. A lone rider named William Cassidy rode slowly along a dusty trail that snaked through the sun-scorched lands of Arizona. The year was 1883. Over the last 10 years, the Wild West had grown grim, a place where law was the strength of a fist, and kindness a sign of weakness. Will was tough as nails, hardened by gunfights and desert storms, but his eyes, deep and mournful, gave away a man who had lost something important. He wasn't looking for adventure, he only wanted to get to his humble ranch and forget the world that had taken everything from him. His horse, a chestnut gelding named Comet, froze, twitching its ears. Ahead, on the side of the road, lay a large, sloppily tied jute sack. William reined in his horse. He knew that in such places, strange sacks were either a trap or someone's dirty secret, one best left alone. A deadly silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind. Will was about to ride on when he heard it. Mama, it wasn't just a sound, but a barely audible, strained whisper, full of pain and fear. It pierced William instantly, making his heart ache. Will could ignore robbers, bandits, and even hunger, but this weak, childlike voice called to a part of his soul he had long buried. Will dismounted from his horse, ignoring the risk. The sack was heavy, its surface lumpy. William carefully untied the rope, and his eyes, accustomed to harshness, whitened in shock. Inside, curled up, lay a little boy, no older than 5 or 6. His blond hair was tousled, and his thin face, covered in dust, was streaked with tears. A dried cut was visible on his forehead, and his hands were tied behind his back with coarse twine. The boy trembled like an autumn leaf, and his eyes, large and terrified, stared at William with boundless despair. "Mama," he whispered again. William felt a sharp pang of compassion that was stronger than any survival instinct. He quickly freed the child's hands and, lifting him into his arms, felt how light he was. His back was covered in bruises, and his thin shirt was torn in several places. This wasn't just a sack of trash, it was someone's sacrifice, thrown out to die in the desert. Who could do such a thing, and why?
I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel, so you will help me in motivation to make such great stories for you, and I will see that you like them. Enjoy watching, everyone.
Will sat the boy on the saddle in front of him and rode on slowly. He asked questions, but the child just remained silent, clinging to him. His name was George. He barely spoke. At times he would just mumble the name Jacob and then fall silent again, staring into the void. William realized that this boy had gone through something terrible, and his mind was now shut down. He was taking him to his ranch, hoping that the quiet and care would help him. At the ranch, which William called the refuge, his loyal dog, Sal, an old, wise sheepdog, was waiting for him. Sal immediately sensed the boy was in trouble and cautiously sniffed him, licking his hand. For the first time, George smiled, and that faint but genuine smile became the most important reward for William. Will bathed George, changed him into a clean shirt that was much too big, and fed him hot stew. The boy ate hungrily but slowly, as if he couldn't believe the food wouldn't run out. Later, when George was asleep in a warm bed in the small room, William sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunset. Questions swirled in his mind. Who could do this to a child? And what did the name Jacob mean? Was it his father, the one who kidnapped him? The next morning, William tried to talk to George again, but without success. The boy was withdrawn, as if mute, but he showed a surprising interest in horses. He carefully petted Comet's muzzle, and to William's surprise, the horse responded with a soft snort. He could sit by the corral for hours, watching the horses. It was his only joy. A few days later, Will decided to ride to the nearest town, Red River. He wanted to find out if a child had gone missing in the area. He left George in Sal's care, strictly telling the boy not to go anywhere. In Red River, he was met with disappointment. The sheriff, a large, taciturn man named Bob, just shrugged. "Kids go missing here every day, Cassidy. This is the Wild West, not a home for lost souls." No one's going to go looking for some boy unless he has rich parents. The sheriff's words were cruel but true. Will returned to the ranch with a heavy heart. On the way, he noticed he was being watched by two men on horseback. They kept their distance, but their silhouettes were clearly visible on the horizon. William realized that his action had not gone unnoticed. Someone knew he had taken the bow, and that someone was now following him. He spurred Comet on, his heart pounding. He had to get back to the ranch as quickly as possible. The feeling of impending threat was almost tangible. William pushed the horse hard, but managed to reach the refuge before sunset. After locking the gate and making sure George was safe, he took out his old, trusted Winchester and took a position on the porch. It was going to be a long night, and he knew it would be the beginning of a real intrigue, in which he and little George, or just pawns in someone else's game. He was ready to fight to protect this boy he had saved from the sack. The following days turned into a harsh game of cat and mouse for William Cassidy. The two men he had seen on the road hadn't vanished. They didn't get closer, didn't attack, but their presence was palpable. Will saw their silhouettes on the hilltops, noticed their horses' tracks at the border of his land. It wasn't just a threat, it was a constant, crushing reminder that he couldn't relax for a second. He stopped leaving the ranch. His days consisted of routine chores and vigilant watching of the horizon. He spent his nights on the porch, his rifle at the ready. George remained withdrawn. The only thing that revealed anything about him was his play with Comet and Sal. Will noticed that when the boy sat near the horse, she became calmer than ever, as if she felt his pain. And Sal, his loyal sheepdog, didn't leave George's sight, as if she were his personal guard. The compassion of the animals for the child evoked a mix of sadness and admiration in Will. He saw how the boy's little soul was slowly but surely thawing in their presence. Jacob, George once whispered in his sleep. Will, sitting on the porch, flinched. He carefully approached the boy's bed. "Who is Jacob, George?" he asked softly, but the boy didn't answer. He just tossed and turned, clutching the corner of the blanket. Will knew he had to act. This intrigue with the pursuers and the bow's secret gave him no peace. He decided that he and George had to disappear, to go somewhere they wouldn't be found. His old friend, an Apache named Logan, lived high in the mountains, far from civilization. They wouldn't be looked for there. At dawn the next day, Will packed all the necessities: food, water, ammunition, warm clothes. He tied them to George's saddle and Comet's, and taking his Winchester, they set off. But the pursuers seemed to have anticipated his move. Just a few miles from the ranch, William heard the sound of a shot ricocheting off the rocks. He abruptly reined in his horse. Two riders, who appeared from behind the cliffs, spurred their horses on, trying to catch up with them. Will turned his horse around, shielding George. He didn't want to get into a fight with a child in his arms, but he had no choice. Will told George to hold on tight. He fired a warning shot, but the bandits didn't stop. They weren't ordinary robbers. They acted methodically, in sync. At the most tense moment, when they were trapped between the cliffs, Will noticed something strange. One of the bandits, a tall, sturdy man with a thick black beard, wasn't aiming at William. His gaze was fixed on George. He shouted, "Jacob, bring him back. He's our merchandise." This revelation was like a punch to the gut. Jacob wasn't the boy's name. It was the name of the one who kidnapped him, and the one who left him to die. But why were they calling William Jacob? And why had George mumbled that name when he was in the sack? Suddenly, 3 more riders appeared behind the pursuers. They were dressed in dusty but clean clothes, their movements quick and precise. One of them, with a keen gaze and a scar on his cheek, took aim and fired. The shot was accurate, and one of the bandits fell from his horse. "Don't touch him. That's my son," one of the newcomers shouted, his voice full of despair. But his cry was interrupted by a new turn of events that caused Will to feel shocked. The second bandit, seeing that they were being overtaken, turned and fired at the man who was shouting, but the bullet hit the horse's head, and it shrieked and fell. The man, whom Will recognized as Jacob, fell but wasn't seriously injured. The bandit who had been watching George all this time began shooting at William. Will returned fire, but he realized he was running out of ammo. Meanwhile, one of the newcomers dismounted and ran to Jacob, helping him up. "Jacob, what the hell is this?" he asked. "They're selling children," Jacob explained breathlessly, pointing at the pursuers. He saved my son. I know it. I didn't expect this myself." Everything fell into place. George wasn't Jacob's son. Jacob, apparently, was a member of some gang that trafficked children. The boy had cried out his name because he knew him, And then Jacob, perhaps on his own, for some unknown motive, decided to abandon George so he wouldn't become part of this dirty business. But how could George have known about him? Will, meanwhile, continued to fire back. At that moment, he noticed an expression on Jacob's face that he hadn't expected to see: deep compassion. He wasn't George's father, but it seemed his conscience had awakened. He got up and, without hesitation, drew his pistol and shot his former accomplice. The bandit fell, and Jacob, seeing that Will was no longer in the line of fire, aimed his pistol at him, but didn't shoot. "I just want him to be safe," Jacob whispered. He knew that Will wouldn't leave the boy alone, so he took a desperate step himself to help him. The shootout ended as suddenly as it began. One bandit was dead, the second wounded, and the three men, including Jacob, stood with their weapons lower. William Cassidy, with his rifle at the ready, didn't take his eyes off them. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and fear. "Don't shoot, Cowboy," one of the men, a tall man with straw-colored mustaches, yelled. "We're from Pinkerton. We were hired to catch these scumbags. And you, it seems, did our job for us." Will still didn't believe them. In the Wild West, lawmen often turned out to be far worse than bandits. But the man's eyes were honest, and their actions in the fight spoke for themselves. They had saved him. "What about the bow?" Will asked, not lowering his rifle. "We don't know. We got on the trail of this gang in a child kidnapping case. Their leader, a man nicknamed Scythe, takes bows and sells them to plantations in the southern states. He never leaves witnesses." Jacob, his face pale with remorse, interrupted them. "It's true. I was with them. I hated it, but I was part of it. When we kidnapped George, I couldn't do it. His mother, she died in my arms. She begged me to save him. I couldn't kill him. I just left him, hoping someone would find him. I knew they'd kill me if they found out. I never thought they'd be the one shooting them to protect this kid." Will felt his anger toward Jacob turn to compassion. He was a man cornered by life, who had done terrible things but hadn't completely lost his soul. George was proof of his last chance at redemption. Jacob lowered his eyes. "I know I deserve a bullet, but I need to know he's safe." William's gaze shifted to George, who had been sitting silently on command all this time. The boy hadn't said a word, but his small body was trembling. He had heard everything. He understood everything. "Jacob," George said softly. For the first time, he said something other than a whisper. His eyes, filled with fear, looked at the man. It was a shock. The boy wasn't just repeating a name. He recognized him. He had witnessed Jacob abandoning him to certain death. Will froze. Jacob's emotions at that moment were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He stepped forward, trying to reach the boy, but Will shielded him. "Don't you dare," Will snapped. "You left him on the road. You left him to die. He saw you do it. Whatever you said, he won't believe you." Jacob lowered his hands. His shoulders slumped. He no longer made excuses. The Pinkerton agent, who introduced himself as Harry, intervened. "We need to get to Reed River. We can protect him there, find his family." William shook his head. "No, we're going to the mountains. I know a man there I can trust. The boy is only safe with me." He had already made up his mind. He would not give George to anyone. Harry understood that arguing was pointless. He gave Will his office address in town, insisting that Will contact them about what was happening. "When the time comes, get in touch. We need witnesses. Kidnapping children is something we don't forgive, especially when it concerns Scythe." William nodded. He knew that Scythe wouldn't leave them alone until he found George. And now, besides his own life and the boy's, he felt responsible for Jacob, who, it seemed, had atoned for his guilt. They continued their journey to the mountains, leaving the bodies of the bandits behind and the Pinkerton agents, who were heading to Reed River. When the sun began to set, William and George finally reached the place where Logan, the Apache, lived. His home was hidden in the cliffs, surrounded by pines. Logan, an old Indian with wise eyes, came out to meet them. He didn't ask questions, but his look, full of understanding, said more than any words. He immediately saw the pain in the boy's eyes and the weariness in Will's. George, seeing Logan, showed no fear. He walked up to him and, looking up, said a full sentence for the first time in a long while. "Your mama is waiting for you." Will froze. He didn't know what that meant. He waited for an explanation, but Logan, bending down, calmly took the boy's hand and led him into the house. On the porch, Logan turned to Will. He said, "You saved him, but he forgot about it. His soul was in the sack. His body is here. You brought him here so I could heal him. Will didn't understand. What are you talking about? Logan sighed. You must not forget what happened, but you must forgive yourself for not being able to save those dear to you. You won't be able to help another until you accept your pain. And then it dawned on William what Logan was talking about. This Indian saw right through him. Will had never told anyone about his past. In his youth, he was married and had a son, but their home was attacked, and he couldn't protect them. He had been away, and when he returned, it was too late. His son was about the same age as George. Since then, he had lived with a sense of guilt. It was an epiphany. This was the moment he finally understood why he couldn't pass by the sack, why his heart had ached. He wasn't saving a stranger, he was saving his own son, whom he had lost many years ago. William sat on the porch, his eyes filled with tears. It was so simple and so terrible. He had lived for so long, running from this past, and now it had found him in the form of little George. Logan brought him a cup of warm tea. You are ready to live on, Cowboy. Now you know what true hope is. William felt a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in many years. He realized that his story wasn't over. He wasn't just saving a boy, he was healing himself. But this victory over himself was only the beginning. Will knew that Scythe wouldn't stop. He still had to face the consequences of his choice. The following weeks in the mountains flew by. Under Logan's and William's care, George began to thaw. He still spoke little, but his eyes were no longer filled with terror. Sal and Comet became his inseparable companions, and the long hours spent with them became the best therapy. Logan taught George simple things: how to identify animal tracks, how to listen to the whine, how to understand nature. William, in turn, taught him how to care for horses, mend harnesses, and throw rocks. One evening, as they sat by the fire, George spoke. He said his father had worked on a ranch that raised horses and that he had been kidnapped with other children. He remembered that one of the men, named Jacob, was always different from the others. He often brought him food and once gave him a small wooden airplane. He said I should be strong, like an airplane that flies high in the sky. The boat whispered. This revelation gave William hope. He realized that Jacob might not have been as evil as he seemed. He was a man cornered by life, but who hadn't lost his last shred of humanity. And now that George himself had told him this, William felt it was time to act. He couldn't hide forever. He had to end this once and for all. The next morning, William and George left Logan's sanctuary. Their path led to Red River. William knew it was risky, but he believed that only in town could they find the Pinkerton agents and put an end to Sith's gang. Logan gave them a farewell message. Don't be afraid to go toward your destiny, William. It is waiting for you. In Red River, the usual commotion reigned. William, with his hat pulled low, quickly guided George through the streets to the Pinkerton office. To his surprise, he found not only Harry there, but also Jacob. He was wounded in the shoulder and was sitting, leaning against the wall. I was waiting for you, Cassidy, Jacob said. I know you don't trust me, but I knew sooner or later you'd come. I have to tell you something. Scythe is my brother. He was always cruel, and this business with the children is his doing. But I couldn't watch. I wanted to stop him, but I was afraid. And when I abandoned George, I knew they would send their men after me. I did it to cover their tracks and lead them away from you. I knew you wouldn't just ride past. William felt a deep surprise. He hadn't expected Jacob to be so selfless. He had sacrificed himself to save a boy he barely knew, and this act, in turn, had given him a chance at redemption. At that moment, two men burst into the office. Their faces were familiar till they were Jacob's accomplices, who had not rushed into the chase, but had decided to go to the town. This was the very climax William had been waiting for. Scythe couldn't accept his brother's betrayal and had come to take what he considered his. The fight began. William, Jacob, and the Pinkerton agents fought shoulder to shoulder. It was a desperate battle, but they were fighting for a just cause. At one point, William saw that one of the bandits was aiming at George, who was hiding under a table. In the same instant, Jacob, without hesitation, shielded the boy with his own body. A bullet lodged in his chest. William, in a rage, shot the bandit. Jacob fell, bleeding, but his eyes, filled with relief, were fixed on George. I did it, he whispered before his soul left his body. The battle was over. Scythe was captured. William went to Jacob and closed his eyes. He was not a saint, but he had done what he had to do. He had atoned for his guilt. In the end, when everything was settled, William stood on the street with George. The boy looked up and at him. "Mama is waiting for me," he said. "I know she's up there, beyond the clouds." William smiled. He no longer felt the pain of losing his own son. He had found him in George. Conclusion: a lesson for the 21st century. This story from the Wild West of the 1880s, filled with dust, gunpowder, and blood, tells us that you cannot judge a person by a single action. Jacob, who was involved in a terrible business, found the strength for redemption. His compassion for the boy, which he had hidden for so long, ultimately changed his fate. In the modern world, where we are surrounded by quick judgments and superficial conclusions, this story reminds us that every person is complex. Everyone can be both bad and good. We all make mistakes, but like Jacob, we can find the strength to correct them. This story also tells us that true strength is not the strength of a weapon, but the strength of spirit. William could have ridden past the sack, leaving the boy to die, but he didn't. He showed compassion, and it changed his life forever. In our world, where there is so much pain and injustice, this story is an inspiration. It shows that even the smallest act of kindness can change not just one life, but a whole destiny.